Drive out into any of Healdsburg's valleys today and look at the big flat vineyards stretching from the road to the water. 60 years ago, that was all prune orchards. Hi, I'm Joanne Taeuffer. I'm one of the museum docents, and I grew up on a prune farm on Magnolia Drive, just south of town, on a ranch bordered on one side by the Russian River and on the other by Dry Creek. Come with me now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, and I'll tell you all about the days when prunes were king in Healsburg. In the early days of Healsburg agriculture, crops were diverse. Farmers grew all kinds of fruits and vegetables, everything a small farming community needed to be self-sufficient. There was even wheat in Alexander Valley. My family's farm, established in 1880, was hops and peaches, and my great-grandfather Ernest planted melons one year and corn another year between the tree rows to get an extra crop in. This photo is the dry yard. We think this was peaches, although in later years the same dry yard and trays were used for prunes. And as times changed, farmers were more likely to grow cash crops. And the area has seen three cash crops: hops, prunes, and grapes. Each had their heyday or heydays, and the triplets depicted on this 1910 brochure about Healsburg agriculture represent those crops. Hops were planted here early on, but two things happened. There was a wilt in the ground, and it became more difficult to propagate hops, and Prohibition in 1920 threw a wrench into the economy for agricultural products used to produce alcoholic beverages. There was also a nascent wine industry in Healsburg in its early years, but again, Prohibition brought that to a screeching halt. But grapes got a second chance. In post-1970 Healsburg, the wine industry rose again with the fortunes of the California wine industry to get to where we are today. But in the years between 1920 and 1970, prunes were king. And here are the numbers to prove it from the Sonoma County crop reports. Let's look at what the revenue from the main Healsburg agricultural crops were, and let's see what the roller coaster ride that it can be to be a farmer. 1928, this is the first year of county crop reports, and we're well into the Prohibition era. Prunes earning almost $3 million, grapes $1.5 million. The acreage of prunes and grapes in the county was about even, because grapes continued to grow on the hillsides where prunes couldn't be cultivated. In 1950, it was prime prune times. Prunes $6.6 million, grapes still $1.5 million. But by 1969-70, the revenue of prunes and grapes is about even at $5 million. This was the time when prune orchards were being pulled out wholesale and replaced with grapes. And only 5 years later, wow, here's what happened. Grape revenue is triple that of prunes, and the acreage is changed dramatically. The plantings from the 1970 have come into bearing. The heyday of prunes was over. Now, here's a young prune orchard in blossom in happier times for the crop. Prunes were not new in 1920s. In fact, at Luther Burbank Garden in Santa Rosa, I learned that in 1881, Walter Dutton, a local farmer, asked nurseryman Luther Burbank to supply him with 20,000 prune trees. That's something like 150 or 200 acres worth of prunes. Not surprisingly, they flourished. And by 1924, prunes were so important that when the Healsburg Chamber of Commerce had a contest for the best motto for the town, the winner was Buckle of the Prune Belt. Now, here's how prunes were cultivated, harvested, and packaged back in the day. First of all, you had to have the right equipment, and a tractor was a must. This is a homemade tractor made by the Healsburg Machine Company in 1916 or 17. It was probably the first motorized tractor in town. And here's my dad with his tractor, a McCormick Deering tractor, an International Harvester brand. This tractor dated from the mid-1930s. Now, tractor has many uses: spraying, plowing, dragging irrigation pipe into the field. In my house, it apparently had another use. When I was a little baby and wouldn't go to sleep, my father would fire up the tractor, put me on his lap and ride me down to the back of the ranch and back. And even though I was on this tractor that was bucking and making noise and smoking, by the time I got home, I was ready. I was asleep. In 1960, it was time for a new tractor at our house, and even though there aren't a lot of photos from the farm, this was definitely a photo op. Here are my parents on the tractor, and here are the kids. Now, another must was an orchard truck. Ours was a 1937 Dodge laundry truck, originally used by Galleon Laundry in San Francisco. It came to us sometime in the 1950s, because I can remember when it happened. My great-uncle Joe was the foreman of the auto shop at the laundry, and he arranged for my dad to buy this vehicle that was being retired. But it was seriously remodeled for orchard use. The top was cut off for a sleek convertible look, and a wooden flatbed was added to the back. Now, I learned to drive on this truck. It was so old, it had a compound low, and you had to double clutch between first and second gear. Once I learned to drive this truck, I never had any trouble shifting a regular car. This is the life of a farm girl. Now, what do farmers do all year? Well, in the winter, when the trees are dormant, they're pruning to maximize production and keep the limbs high enough to allow farm equipment to pass underneath. This photo from the museum archive shows Tom Phillips, Joe Mengali, and Charles Hogue pruning in about 1965. My dad especially enjoyed pruning, maybe the aesthetic joy in shaping those trees. But as he aged and his knees got a little sore, he got a new piece of equipment. It was called the squirrel. Now, you can drive this out into the tree you want to prune, get into that little box at the front, and voila! The farmer is ready to do their pruning without any knee damage at all. So the farmers were always trying to stay one step ahead of dangers for their crops as well. For instance, frosts. All the farmers had smudge pots. They were used to create a blanket of smoke and heat that would protect trees from frost damage. At our house, these were just old buckets with something flammable inside. On frost warning nights, my father would get up in the wee hours to check the temperature. If it was going too low, he would call my cousins Leon and Pete Del Coletto to come down from their house in town, and they would light the smudge pots. And here's what happened if the smudge pots didn't work. April 8th, 1953. This is a newspaper photo of George Vellatini, manager of the California Prune and Apricot Growers Association, inspecting branches of local prune trees that were damaged by the severe frost. The temps had gone down into the 20s on the morning of April 8, 1953. This would have been within weeks after the trees blossomed, and the fruit was very immature and just setting. A bad time for a cold snap. There was extensive damage done to the prune trees and the grape crops. And instead of 50 tons of dry prunes that year, my father's crop was 2 tons. He filed a loss for the year on his income taxes, and the next year he was borrowing against his future crop to fund his operations. And here's the rest of the story. On that same day, the evening of April 8th, my sister was born. This is my parents' second child, and there was a campaign among the farmers on Magnolia Drive that she be named Frosty. Well, I think my mother prevailed on this issue, and my sister was named Judith May. But Mr. Puccinelli, the farmer down the road, called her Frosty for the rest of his life. Now, frosts weren't the only problem, in fact, not even the most common problem. That would have been pests like insects, aphids, scales, mites, and more. And brown rot, which can ruin fruit on the trees or in the boxes even after they're dried. Prune farmers would spray at least twice a year to prevent these pests. I can remember my father coming in from spraying, wearing rain gear, dripping and smelly. He would strip and shower in the porch before coming into the house. Bottom line, it's a jungle out there. Well, eventually it was time for harvest. This was the crescendo of the year. Now, we had a harvest crew, the Scott family, that lived in Corcoran in San Joaquin County, where they picked cotton for a living. They worked for our family in the early 1950s until the mid-1970s, when the senior Scotts were ready to retire. Basically my whole farm life. Every summer the day would come when the phone would ring and it would be Mr. Scott asking if they could come and pick our crop again, and if they could come up now and live in the house next door that we called the Picker's Cabin. They would be there before the prunes were ready, so they could pick beans and other fruit such as pears and go to Lake County to fish. After the prune harvest, they might stay to cut grapes. The Scotts were a rarity. They were African American, I think the only black crew in town. I have no idea how they came to work for us, but they were an institution. And here's how the harvest worked. Prunes got ripe about mid-August, and the harvest might have taken about a month. Prunes were harvested by shaking the trees using a long pole with a hook on the end so that all of the ripe fruit would fall on the ground. Then the pickers went to work, crawling under the trees, picking prunes into a bucket, and then dumping them into lug boxes. When I was a kid, pickers were paid 25 cents a box. Now, these aren't the Scotts. I don't have any photos of the Scotts. They were too busy for a photo op. These prune pickers are the Schmidt family working on their family farm in Dry Creek. In fact, many kids in town picked prunes to pay for their school clothes. Some did very well, but if I had to rely on my earnings for my school clothes, I would have looked like what my mother would have called a ragamuffin. Since prune season was an all-hands-on-deck project for many families, it sometimes clashed with the start of school. Museum docent Don Mitchell's father was the manager of the large Sunsweet commercial prune dryer in South Healdsburg. Each August, his dad would get a phone call from the school superintendent asking about the status of the harvest. Was it late? Was it on time? If the harvest was late, the start of school would be moved back to allow students to pick prunes. And if the estimated dates for the harvest were wrong and it went late, the start of school would be postponed, sometimes by more than a week. After picking, prunes were dipped in hot lye water to clean them, but even more so to break down the skin a little bit so that they wouldn't puff up when they dried, especially in the sun. This is Moses Scott and Sylvester at the dipping platform, and my dad is up there behind all that steam. Once the prunes were dipped, they would be dried in the sun. They would be put on trays and put out in the sun. Imperials needed to be rolled so they didn't sunburn, and if it rained, the trays had to be quickly stacked and covered to prevent them from getting wet. In the 1950s and 60s, prune drying processes changed. Prune growers built their own dehydrators or paid to have their prunes dried at commercial dehydrators. These prune dryers were big concrete block buildings with large fireboxes to generate dry hot air and fans to circulate it. The prunes were on trays, stacked on rolling frames that went into their dryers, and 18 hours later, they had dry prunes. These are new tunnels under construction at the Co-op south of town in 1966. Another big commercial dryer was Sunsweet on Healdsburg Avenue. Here's Al Barbieri delivering prunes at Sunsweet circa 1966. And here are the tunnels. You can see these at the old plant, which now houses a self-storage business on Healdsburg Avenue, almost at the bridge. Now, Sunsweet didn't just dry the prunes. They also bought them from farmers and packaged them for sale. There were other packing houses in town. My father sold to Mary Annie's, which had a dryer and a packing operation out on East Side Road. Now, in later years of prunes in Healdsburg, the industry started focusing more on advertising and product innovations. Here are some examples. From 1958, a prune party for kids. Look at those prune pies, yum. And I remember having a button like this one in 1974. Prunes keep the country moving, oh yes. And here was an innovation our family very much enjoyed, chocolate-covered prunes. This may have been the first time we actually enjoyed eating prunes. Turns out anything is yummy if you dip it in enough chocolate. One more marketing note. From 1960 to 1985, Healsburg sponsored the Prune Blossom Tour. There would be busloads of people coming from the Bay Area to see the beautiful white blossoms falling on the carpet of yellow mustard. And they would stop at the villa or the Alexander Valley Community Center, where they would be offered prune cookies made by the 4-H clubs in town. But the end came, and pretty fast. Sunsweet went from processing 170,000 tons in 1971 to less than 5,000 tons in 1981. Well, the prune industry is gone from Healdsburg, but their memories remain, and these have been some of my favorite. And that's the story of prunes in Healdsburg. If you enjoyed the talk, please subscribe to our channel and check out the other presentations available. I'll see you next time.